everybody see that main title slot? Okay, great. All right then. So apologies if you were at the first one. You'll have heard all this blurb about me already, but I better do it in case some people weren't. So hello. My name's Kitty. As I said, there'll be time for questions and discussion at the end. So a quick little bit about me. I was a bit of a late starter for university. I went in my sort of mid-30s, and then I got a job in the university that I'd graduated from as a creative media technician. I also did an MA there on their employee development scheme. And now I'm a freelance audio producer. I work with community organisations, which I started off by volunteering, which I can highly recommend. It was brilliant. I've worked for people like Under the Stars, Sheffield Maincap, Darts, etc. I also work for lots of festivals. I've worked for DocFest. I work for Off the Shelf. I make a podcast series for Festival of the Mind. I also work for arts organisations, so people like East Street Arts, Arts Catalyst, Counterpoints, Artreach, Flux. I also make a lot of university public engagement content, a lot for the University of Sheffield, some for Sheffield Hallam, Uni of Exeter, Durham, York, etc. And I'm a musician and a DJ, and I'm in a band called Speed Full of Us. Go and check it out. Little mini plug there. Okay, what are we going to cover today? So in the previous session last week, we already covered organising your stuff, your content for the podcasting format. And the slides and the recording, I think, will be available from the Flux team periodically. So today we're going to talk about recording. We're going to go through prepping to record. We're going to look at some of the equipment that is available to you via Flux. We're going to look at multi-track versus single-track recording. We're going to talk about some in-session production techniques and some and the difference between in-person and online recordings. We're going to look at file management and additional assets management, so how to organize and categorize your files. We're going to look at editing, so we're going to look at some DAWs, some DAWs, which stands for Digital Audio Workstation. So those are the applications that you use to edit audio. Now I'm going to demo my workflow in Logic Pro X, which is the DAW of choice that I use, but there are lots out there. And we'll also have a quick look at Audacity, which is the best open source free choice for multi-track DAW. We're going to have a quick look at mixing, so the balancing of levels of multi-track sessions, so different types of audio coming in. And then finally, we're going to look at the output, sometimes referred to as mastering. So the final stage of audio production, putting the finishing touches to your mix to optimize playback across multiple systems, platforms, and formats. Okay, everybody hear me all right? Give me a thumbs up. Yep, good, okay. So first, let's talk about in-person recording scenarios. So we touched on this a little bit before in the last session, but space and suitable space. So we talked about how smaller is nearly always better, and to avoid places like kitchens and bathrooms that are super reflective. Carpeted spaces are usually better sounding than those without, and likewise those with lower ceilings. You're looking to minimize the echoes and reflections of a room to help the voices inside that room sound as neutral and as natural as possible. A recce. Now, I love a recce, and doing a pre-record recce is always a really good idea. So you get an idea, especially if you haven't been somewhere before, you get an idea of the space that you'll be working in. or you might even get a glimpse of an alternative or different space in the same location. So we're always trying to get things right pre-edit rather than that kind of fix it in post approach, which is not the one as far as I'm concerned. So the use of scripts. So for our recording prep, we'd have a script or a schedule of some description as a guide for recording. And I would often use that script or that schedule for taking notes and annotating whilst we go during that session. Now, recording in person, in my opinion, is always preferable to recording online. However, sometimes online is necessary, most commonly because of geographical distances involved. But in most cases, you're going to get more from your guests from an in-person situation. It's easier to pick up on body language and non-verbal cues when you're in the room with those people. But like I said, however, it's simply just not possible to get everyone in the same room at the same time. So I'll talk you through some scenarios for making recordings online later on in this session. Okay. So, single versus multi-track recording. So if it at all possible, it's always best to try and get a separate recording of each voice within your podcast, resulting in a multi-track edit, a bit like this. So I've actually edited this already, but this is a screenshot of a multi-track project. So all the tracks down the left-hand side, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in this particular recording. And I've recorded a track for each person's speech. There's also a track there for music, and there looks to be an ambient mic in there as well. But recording a separate track for each voice gives you much better control in the editing and mixing process. So it essentially gives you the ability to be able to treat each voice separately, because each voice will be separate, but also it will be different. You know, all voices are different. There are different levels, different types of sibilants, for instance. So the sounds, they might be lower or higher in register, and also people speak in different ways, so their vernacular is going to be different. They might have more ums and ahs. They might use more connecting words that you might want to treat differently and separately. Versus a single track recording. So this is a single track recording here, and that was recorded with just one single audio recorder. And in that scenario, you're going to end up with something that looks like this image at the bottom here, which is much harder to edit as there's only one track. So if you've got multiple voices on that single track recording, it's going to be very difficult to treat them separately because they're all just on one file. Okay. So that's single versus multi-track. Right, okay, the difference between mono and stereo. So this is a mono recording. Monophonic audio is an audio from one single source, like this first image here. Stereophonic audio or stereo audio comes from multiple sources which present the image of a left and a right in the audio field, like the image at the bottom here. And we can see the difference by looking at the waveforms. So a waveform is a graphic representation of the shape of a wave that indicates its characteristics as frequency and amplitude. Now, you don't need to remember that, but you'll hear people talk a lot about waveforms. That's what they are. They're simply a visualization of the audio itself. Now then, generally, capturing dialogue recordings in mono, like the image at the top of this slide, is preferable because audio is recorded only from the center in mono. So any movement of the person in relation to the mic is only perceived as loud or quiet. rather than both loud and quiet and left and right in the stereo field. And conversely, generally capturing field recordings or ambience or bedding, as we talked about in the previous session, is usually captured in stereo. So like the image at the bottom of this presentation slide, the bottom of this slide. Okay. Everybody following along all right? Yep. Thumbs up. Okay. Good. Thank you. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about equipment and in particular equipment that will be available to you via Flux. So for single track stereo recording, this Zoom H1N we talked about before in the previous session, the little mini recorders are one of the easiest audio recorders to use, and Zoom and Tascam are the main players in this market. So this is one-touch recording with easily adjustable settings. Now this recorder will only ever give you a single stereo track recording. So it's good for field recordings or ambience or bedding audio or even recording your own sound effects, but it's perhaps not so preferable for multi-speaker recordings. So for multi-speaker or multi-track recordings, the Zoom H4n and the PodTrack P4 can both make multi-track recordings. The H4n, so the first in that graphic on the left-hand side, has a built-in stereo mic and also two separate mic inputs. Although it's worth noting here that those two external mic inputs will mix themselves down inside this recorder to a stereo file. And for dialogue, you then need to split those into two mono tracks. That's quite easy to do in Audacity. Now the PodTrack P4, which is the second on the right-hand side of that graphic, makes up to 4 individual mono recordings. And what it also does in the PodTrack is it captures a stereo mix of all 4 channels. So you can quite easily listen to a stereo mix of everything that's happened and then treat all the files, all the individual channels separately. Now, the most common way to power all these portable devices is with batteries. And you need good quality, either AAA or AA batteries. So I use Duracell Industrial. There are others available, but I know that they are really good quality and they will last. Portable audio recorders need a lot of power, and normal batteries just do not cut the mustard. They just, you know, you'll go out and you'll start a session and then 10 minutes later it's showing you that they're on the way out. However, more and more commonly now, these kind of portable audio recorders are being powered by power banks using special USB cables, which is much, much better for the planet and still makes you portable and still means you don't have to carry too much gear, and you don't have to carry lots of batteries either. And I think Flux are going to put some of those power banks into some of these kits, which is very cool and groovy and so much better for the planet. Back to batteries though, if you do go for batteries, make sure, even if you've got like 2 or 3 bars on your battery, put a new set in every time you start a recording. It's good practice, it's best practice, and it means that you know you're starting from a good place. Okay. If any of these kits of equipment come with accessories like tripods or hand grips, it's always a good idea to use them. So you're isolating your recorder either from a surface you're working on, like a desk or a table, for instance, or your hand if you're doing a handheld recording, because they're super sensitive and they will pick up vibrations of things that they're on. So it's always a good idea to use that. And also, most portable audio recorders can also act as an external sound card, which means that you could, if you wanted to, hook them up to a computer and record straight into a DAW, so into something like Audacity or Logic Pro, if you wanted to. That's worth remembering. Okay, this bit's a bit dense. Apologies for the text. Recording settings. So we talked a little bit about the difference between a WAV and an MP3 last week. So a WAV is an uncompressed audio file and an MP3 is a compressed audio file. And compression here means asking the computer or the audio recorder to make decisions for you about what information you keep and what you leave out. So what I suggest is you work in WAV when you record and edit, and then what usually happens is you will export MP3s, but you've worked in the best quality you can to start off with. So sample rates. Sample rate is a number of samples captured per second. So a piece of audio with a sample rate of, for instance, 44.1 kilohertz has 44,100 samples per second. Now, the number of samples captured per second determines the frequency range that can be captured and reproduced. However, most people can't tell the difference, certainly not between 44.1 and 48. So the trick really, don't worry too much about it, just pick one and stick to it. What will, if you start recording them at different sample rates, so there's a bit here that's 44.1 and then you use a bit of music that's 48 and then there's something else that's 44.1, then you'll get in a tiswas in the edit. So it doesn't really matter which one you choose there, just pick one and stick with it, and that's a setting that you can set on your audio recorder. Okay. Again, bit rate. Bit rate refers to the number of bits or binary conversions of audio information. Again, it doesn't matter, and that generally only applies to WAV files. Just pick one and stick to it. But 16-bit is generally pretty good and fine for what most people will need to do. And these are all settings on your audio recorders. The next one, low cut. This is a useful setting often seen on audio recorders and on some mics. And what it will basically do is it will roll off some of the very, very lowest end frequencies. So the very lowest sounds that we can hear. And that's often where the most frequent unwanted background noise can be found. So for instance, it's where our aircon sits. It's where traffic noise is. It's where electrical hum is. So if you have the option to use a low cut function on your audio recorder, it's probably a good idea, certainly with dialogue recording, to use that. Okay. So, auto level. Okay. In my opinion, this is another setting that is on some audio recorders. I would steer clear of auto level because it's a little bit like a compression again. It's not really controllable. And you're basically asking the audio recorder to make some decisions for you. So it will automatically bring the level up to a predetermined point. But with this, you lose control, overall control of the level. And it doesn't help both in terms of bringing up the level of background noise behind it and giving what's called headroom. So leaving enough room in your mix so that things aren't too loud when you start adding and layering audio files together. We'll come back to headroom in a bit and we'll talk a bit more about it. Basically, that's your golden rule there. That's the recording setting that you want for an audio recorder when you're working in WAV to start off with. You want a WAV at 44.1 kilohertz at 16-bit. And if you record with that, you're ready to go. You're cooking on gas. We're all good. Now, there's a link to a good online audio file format explainer in the references section at the end of this slide presentation as well, which will be available to you as a PDF. Okay. I know it's a bit boring, this bit, but we'll get to some more interesting bit in a while. I promise. Okay. A quick little bit about mic placement. So generally, if you're using the Zoom H1 and you are going to use it for dialogue, although I would countenance against it personally, unless it's for one single person rather than multi-person recordings, you want to be about a foot away from the speaker's mouth and pointing up at their mouth. For any single tabletop mics, you're looking at probably about half that from the speaker's mouth and they will usually come with some kind of tabletop mic stand, something like that. For lapel mics, and this one of the sets that Flux have got that comes with the PodTrack P4 recorder has some lapel mics. You'll have seen them on people when they're doing video. There's just a little tiny mic with a clip that just sits around your sternum. That's where you're aiming for, kind of mid-chest. And if a speaker, when you're using a lapel mic, if a speaker is very loud and a bit boomy and has lots of what we call plosives, which are the B and the T and the P sounds that you'll sometimes hear distorting in audio recordings, you can try positioning that mic facing down, actually, rather than up. I would start with up, but if things are distorting a bit, try going down as well, because you're still going to get the speaker, but it might help some of those distorting plosives. Okay. Now then, we talked about recording levels a little bit in the last session. Some people will call them levels, some people will call them input levels, some people will refer to them as gain as well, audio gain. Essentially, this is the volume of the signal coming into the channel of the recorder. Now, level meters can either be shown vertically, like this one, the PodTrack P4. So you can see in the little LED screen there, you've got the 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then you've got little individual levels coming up and down. So they are going up and down to show you what kind of level input is coming into each channel. They can also be shown horizontally. So that's just exactly the same level meter. It's just showing you level coming left to right. Okay, but essentially they're doing the same thing. They're giving you a visual representation of the amount of level coming into your channel or recorder. Now this goes back to talking about the importance of testing, like we talked about last time. We talked about using the breakfast question and breaking the tension a bit by asking people what they had for breakfast to test their level. And we're looking for a level of between about -12 and about -18 dB. Or simplified level meters sometimes are in color. So level meters averaging the top of the green just before the yellow. Or again, alternatively, peaking at about 2/3 up the scale. If you start recording multi-track sessions with any more than about 2/3 for each channel, you're going to have no headroom in your mix for processing, which means when you start layering things on top of each other, they're going to become distorted, and there's kind of nowhere to go in terms of our overall level. So headroom, basically how much room your audio signal has before it starts to get distorted. Okay, everybody's still all right. It's a bit wordy, this, isn't it? It's a bit more deep than the other one. Okay, good. Thank you for still being here. All right. A couple of tips for recording sessions. So a couple of things that now, obviously, these are just things that I do, but I find them really useful whilst I'm doing a recording, because often I have to be the interviewer, I have to be the sound recorder, I have to be the producer all at the same time while I'm doing this. So there are some tips and tricks to help you kind of manage that scenario. So the first one, I'm a big fan of hand claps. A clap to start, a clap to stop, also a clap to sync audio. So in some situations where maybe you've even got two recorders going on at once, or you've maybe online and somebody's making an alternative recording, a clap makes a spike in that waveform like we just talked about, and it's a really easy visual way to see that something has stopped or started or changed in your edit. And it's also a good way to guide your participants as well. So when you start, I would let everyone know that this is a method that you employ in the session, and do interrupt if you need to with a clap. So if you spot something that's not right, let's say somebody is too close or too far away from a mic. Maybe their clothes are interfering with the mic and you can hear it on your headphones. Maybe there's some background noise. Just be polite, clap, ask them to repeat. A really common reason to start off with to interrupt and clap is because perhaps people have started off too quickly, and you might ask them to just take a minute and a few deep breaths and then clap them back in again. And as long as you let everybody know that's your method, they know exactly what that means when you clap. It either means start or stop. As I mentioned before, as I alluded to, we started talking about scripts. I often use a script that comes with a session, whether it's a verbatim script or it's a bit of scheduling or it's some bullet points. I'll use that and I'll annotate it during the session. So I'll take notes. I might take notes of some little golden moments that have happened. I might take notes if somebody does a multiple takes of something. I'll take notes if there's an interruption, and I'll try and note down roughly minutes and seconds of the recording time whilst that's happening. Okay. A couple of other things, tips for the session. Make sure everyone has either switched off or switched on to airplane mode their devices. Don't just put them on silent because you'll get interference, either off or on airplane mode, please. And it's good. Nobody wants those kind of interruptions, and it gives you a clear head and somewhere to start from. Now then, if you've time and it's appropriate, this is probably a bit advanced, but it can be worth recording a few minutes of what's called room tone. Anybody heard of that before? Room tone? Yeah, can see a couple of nods. Okay, room tone is the sound of the room itself without any speaking or dialogue. And this can be really useful in the edit if you have to make really severe cuts to a piece of dialogue. It can be used underneath as a little bed to add pauses or natural gaps back into that dialogue without them going to complete silence, which can be disorientating for an audience, particularly when you're listening on headphones. Okay. And again, during a recording session, a podcast recording session, it's also worth, if you do have a point where it's a good point to stop, it's just worth checking in with everyone at regular intervals when there's an appropriate time that they're okay and that anyone might need a break. It's just good practice. Okay. So a few production tips for your actual recording session. All right, so we've talked a bit about recording in person. Let's have a quick chat about recording online. So here's a little bit about the equipment that you would use for recording online. So, as I mentioned previously, having any kind of external mic, a USB mic or a mic headset will almost always give you or your guests better audio quality than using the internal mics on devices, whether that's a laptop or what's it called? A tablet, oh my goodness, or a mobile phone, for instance. An external microphone is always going to give you better quality audio. This is a Yeti mic. They're a very popular choice of USB microphones. There's many different versions from probably about 50 quid upwards. They give you a built-in adjustable tabletop stand, usually, again, isolating this microphone from whatever desk or table you're working off. They often give you an adjustable, what's called a polar pattern, which is the diagram, the pattern of which a microphone listens, if you like. And they'll often also give you an adjustable input volume. Another really common thing on video calls these days and video recordings is a headset with a mic combined. Now, a really common problem with these, or that I find anyway, is that people often just have them too close to their mouth. So it's right here, like Madonna style, right, stick it in here. Often all you need to do is ask them to just move it ever so slightly, either up or down, or some of them will move out as well. And again, you can just be asking that breakfast question and testing and getting that person to speak again until they're not distorting. But that's a really common problem with online recordings. And of course, it's really essential that you and all of your online participants, when you're making an online recording, wear headphones. Otherwise, your voices won't be isolated from each other. And also, crucially, if you're making the recording, you need to be able to monitor them on headphones as well. And all of what I've said can be used in tandem with Zoom, for instance, like what we're chatting on right now, or any similar other online meeting application. Although I'm going to use Zoom again as an example, but other platforms are available. Okay, so let's talk about recording settings on Zoom. Like I say, other options are available. So in your audio settings on Zoom, when you're setting this up, ready to record, mark suppress background noise as low, as you can see in that. Turn on show in meeting option to enable original sound, and then you can test that with your guest, whether or not it's better or worse for their sound when it's enabled. And turn on, or I certainly turn on, high fidelity music mode as well. So that's in your audio settings. Then in your recording settings in Zoom, turn on record a separate audio file for each participant. And that's where you're going to get your single track for each person that you can then make changes to separately depending on which person's voice we're talking about. Okay. If you're not totally confident of all parties' internet quality, you can ask participants if they can to make a backup recording, either with a phone or a voice note app or with a separate audio recorder if you like. That's another way of kind of hedging your bets a little bit in audio land for online recordings. Now then, there are other in-browser dedicated apps available to do this kind of thing. And one of them is called CleanFeed, which is one of the most popular ones, which does have a free version, but you do have to pay for more functionality. It seems to have a fairly simple interface, and I've heard anecdotal evidence to suggest that it works pretty well. And CleanFeed can also be used in tandem with Zoom, so that your participants in the recording can see each other as well as hear each other. Again, there are other alternatives available, things like Riverside and Descript, but again, they're paid for. But those are online or multi-track audio recording applications. Okay, so those are your settings for online recordings in Zoom. Okay, monitoring. Now, we talked a little bit about monitoring before, and when I say monitoring, I mean monitoring on headphones. So monitoring as in the person who's doing the recording, listening to what's happening. Okay, so a few times now we've talked about the importance of getting a level, using a breakfast question or whatever it is, getting your person to talk and adjusting your gain or input level as necessary to get that kind of 2/3 peak, average peak. So in this graphic here, we're aiming again for somewhere around the -18 to -20 as an average. For some level meters without calibration, as I said before, you'd be aiming for an average peaking about 2/3 of the meter. Again, headroom. This is going to give you enough space in your final mix to be able to add other gain or volume without distorting from other things like music, sound effects, for instance. Now then, in this graphic here, you see towards the top from -12 dB up to 0, as we start to get to the sort of -4, -3, it's starting to go red. And that's where clipping or distortion happens. And there's nothing we can do really in the edit to rectify this. So with that in mind, when you're recording, less is more. Maybe when you first start, err on the side of caution with levels a little bit. If you think they're peaking at about -12, -16, and you're a bit worried, just knock the input level down just a little bit. Just give yourself a bit more room in the edit. Again, give yourself more headroom in the edit. And conversely, for dialogue, anything averaging at sort of -30 or under will prove difficult to treat because the amount of processing involved to get the level up to a reasonable listening volume is also going to bring all the background noise up as well. So this is a little visualization of some waveforms. We talked about the visualizations of sound, of waveform examples of things where the level is just right, the level is too low, and the level is too high. And that's a really just a kind of basic way to sort of be able to look at a waveform and think, that's all right. Or, oh, I've gone a bit too far there, or, oh, there wasn't a lot of level there. Again, I can't stress this enough, monitoring things on headphones and the importance of it to make sure your levels are consistent and to find issues. Things always sound different with your headphones on. Microphones are sensitive and they pick up stuff that human ears can't, or sometimes they filter out things that they think aren't important. Okay, so always be using your headphones for monitoring, whether you're in person or you're online. Okay, so a bit of pre-edit file management. So you finished your recording. Now it's time to organize your files ready for editing. So firstly, you're going to transfer your files from your recorder to your computer. Now, if you can, you've got a card reader. I've got one to hand to you. Little card reader, different types of slots in for all your different cards. If you take your card out of your audio recorder and put it in a card reader, it will give you a much quicker transfer rate. And it's usually, believe it or not, it's a more secure way of doing it rather than attaching the audio recorder, which you can do. The card reader is just better. That's what they're there for. That's what job they're made for. So you've got your files on. So you have a listen. So let's review. Firstly, listen to what you've got, and then further rename those files accordingly. Now, as I talked about before in the previous session, how you do this is totally up to you, but try and choose a method that's consistent across projects. For instance, location dot time dot speaker name, for instance. Then you're going to be able to find your files quickly and efficiently when it comes to editing. And also, if you need to go back to them later on after the project is done and go and find something, you can find it easily. Okay. For remote scenarios where you've asked guests to maybe make a separate recording, get them to rename their files too. Again, I cannot begin to tell you the amount of times I've received a file for a recording for a podcast and it's simply just called podcast or recording. And I've got thousands of these things, probably, yeah, more than that. Renaming is really important for everybody in the process. Okay. DAWs. So a DAW, a digital audio workstation. This is where you're going to do an edit. So what is a DAW? So a digital audio workstation is essentially an application that you use to edit audio files. It's usually time-based with an arrangement window, and that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at Audacity. And the arrangement window shows time from left to right, and the multiple tracks from top to bottom. Now, Audacity is the best, I think, free and open source tool there is to do this. And again, there's a link to that in the reference links at the end of this that you can have as a PDF. So on the top left of this screen, the first little arrow we've got is pointing to the transport bar. So the transport bar in any DAW is where you play, although your space bar on your keyboard for most DAWs will do the same thing. It will start and stop your play button. Okay, so your transport bar, you're playing, you're stopping, you can go to the start or the end of your project, and it's also where you can record straight in. So remember when I said that some of these audio recorders will act as external sound cards? So if you did have one hooked up to this, this is where you would hit record. Okay. So the second bit on the left-hand side of this screen, we're talking about tracks. So those two long bars going horizontally across the screen. Those are 2 tracks, and they've got separate bits of audio on each of them. And here we've got a separate voice track for each voice. But for instance, in your audio project, you'd have one for each voice, you'd have one for any music, you'd have one for any field recording, and one for any sound effects. So you can treat everything differently and adjust levels accordingly. Also, on that track header, which is the first bit on the left-hand side of each track, that's what we call the track header, you can do 2 things there at the top called solo and mute. So solo, as it suggests, if you press solo on a track, you're just listening to that track, you're not listening to anything else. And mute, same thing. If you press mute on a track, when you press play, you'll only hear the other tracks. You won't hear that track you've muted. And that can be really useful if you're working on something particular just within one track and you want to hear one voice or one piece of audio at once. Okay. This is also the next bit at the bottom where it says effects and plugins on the left-hand side. That's where you would do things like add reverb or delay or compression or EQ. So audio processing, that's where you would add it there. It's called effects here. Sometimes it's called plugins as well. Then we've got, as I said, we've got time in well, it's actually just seconds in this particular example. So from 0 to 30, left to right at the top where it says time. And then underneath where it says time, it says regions and clips. So those are separate clips on 1 or 2 here, audio tracks. Sometimes they're called regions and sometimes they're called clips, but they're individual pieces of audio. And if you can imagine listening to this, this is 2 people having a conversation. So there is a gap where the other person is speaking. Okay, it's a really easy way to see that visually. Okay. Also, just on the track headers, there are a couple of other things as well. There's the track pan, which is that little dial that moves between left and right. And that's basically saying that on that track, you could move it to the left or the right if you wanted to, and put some of it more in the left or some of it more in the right. And the one above it with the plus and minus, that's your volume for each track as well. Okay. Now, there are lots of DAWs out there, and my preferred DAW of choice is Logic Pro, and that's not least because I'm a Mac user. So I'm going to demo a few quick workflow tips in that, but the principles that I'm going to show you are the same, and they apply to Audacity. Okay. Everybody all right? Everybody's still with me? Everybody here? Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. So I'm going to take you into the DAW that I use, which is Logic Pro. I'm going to demonstrate importing some files, adding some new tracks, a really basic dialogue processing chain, some cutting up and repositioning of audio, a bit of a placement of using a field recording, and then some exporting of audio. Now, I suggest if you haven't got any headphones on now and you've got some to hand, I would put them on because it's going to make it easier for you to hear what I'm going to demo at the moment if you've got any to hand. All right. So I'm just going to stop sharing for the minute. Oops, desktop 1. Share sound. Okay. Can everybody see this screen now? So it says Flux Demo at the top and tracks. Okay. So this is Logic Pro. This is what I use to edit audio. But like I said, the principles are the same. Now, some of the most common problems that you will find when you first start using something like Audacity are, I can't hear anything. Where is it? Where's the sound? So like Audacity, you will have a preferences setting. And if I go into my audio preferences here, there is an output device and there is an input device. Now for this particular session, I've routed it so you can hear it in Zoom. But normally it might be your headphone output, for instance, if you're working in Audacity, or it might be some external speakers that you've got if you've got an external sound card. But this is where you change your input and output for your audio. Okay. Now then, if you were with us for the first session, we used a couple of online tools, one of which was Typotone. And I've taken the liberty of making a little bit of music with Typotone. I'm going to bring it into this session now. So I'm going to start off by importing some audio. So I'm going to go to File, Import, Audio File. And then I'm going to navigate to the assets that I've made for this demo. And in Typotone, which I raved about last session, it's brilliant. I just put the words Flux and Rotherham in, and it created something really lovely, a little tune. And then all I did was I duplicated them. So there's 4 instances of this. So it's a recurring little musical motif. Really, really simple way to do this. But let's just listen to that. Everybody hear that okay? Okay. All right, so we've got a bit of music. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of music. Then I'm going to bring in a bit of dialogue that I've created. So we're going to make another little track. Oops, I'm going to say new track, new audio track. Okay. Now then, this audio track that I'm going to bring in is a mono recording because it's a dialogue recording. So I'm just going to change it here to make it a mono channel rather than a stereo channel. This is a stereo channel. See, it's got those 2 little overlapping circles. And this is a mono channel. And I'm going to rename this channel and I'm going to call it intro, the dialogue intro. I'm going to get rid of audio too. It's really good practice to always rename your channels so you know what you're looking at. You know, especially if you start getting a really big project, you've got loads of channels in there. Just keep renaming so you know where you are. Okay, so I'm going to import again. We're going to import this dialogue. Audio file. This is a bit of dialogue. So it's a bit of vocal dialogue that I've taken a bit of poetic license. I've used Typotone to make a bit of music. And then in the previous session, we looked for some sound effects and one of them was a train. So I've just made an intro as though we're going to make a little mini podcast introduction about a podcast about transport. Very dry, I'm sorry, but it uses the examples that we kind of touched on from the previous session. So first of all, let's have a little listen to this dialogue.
Hello and welcome to... I'll start that again.
There's a little stumble there. I need to cut that out.
Hello and welcome to Going Places, a new podcast from Flux Rotherham.
I just did a bit of a cough there. We're going to need to cut that out as well. I've just made up a name.
In this episode, we'll be chatting to June Smith.
Then there's a little stumble.
In this episode, we'll be chatting to June Smith from the local transport museum.
Little stumble.
About all things train and tram related in South Yorkshire.
Right, okay. So there's some bits that we need to cut out. But what I'm going to do first is, the way that I do this is that before I start editing dialogue and cutting out all those bits we don't need, I want to process it first. I want to make it sound the best it can before I start cutting stuff up. Okay. So what can be really useful here, and a big part of this process, is iterative. So it goes round and round, and we'll end up quite often doing the same thing over and over again because we're listening for change. We're listening for things to get better. So I'm going to loop round this bit.
Hello and welcome to Going Places.
And you can loop really easily, usually in the timeline at the top, and you can drag a particular, what's called a cycle range, and it will just loop around a particular piece of audio. Okay. So the first thing that I always do, again, this is just the way that I do things, but the first thing that I always do is I add a bit of EQ. And what I do is, if you haven't used your low end already, I'm going to take out some of that low end. So what this is doing is it's saying, I'm going to set a limit as to how much of that low end I listen to. And I'm basically going to cut out anything under about 100 hertz. And people, in terms of a visual analysis of audio, and you'll see it here when it starts.
Hello and welcome to Going Places, a new podcast.
So this is where this audio, this area is where it kind of lives. But we don't need anything under there. And like I said before, anything under about 100 hertz or even 150 hertz, that's where aircon is, that's where traffic noise is, that's where all that background stuff is that you don't need. So all these processing techniques, and I'll show you a couple more, but if you only do one, this is probably the most important one to do, to cut off some of that low end where that background noise lives. Okay, so done a little bit of EQ. Now what I do for dialogue recordings is I add a little bit of compression to them. I'm going to add a compressor here, and I've just got one set up particularly for spoken word. Now then, just move that a little bit. Now a compressor kind of does what it says on the tin. It compresses, it squashes, it tames dynamics. So what you say to a compressor is, I want you to bring down things that are very, very loud, but I want you to bring up things that are very, very quiet. And it gives you a more even audio level across a piece of audio. Generally, what that means is when you compress things to start off with, you take out volume. So you need to put it back in. I'm going to take you through this. So,
hello.
I'm going to cycle through this audio.
Hello, and welcome to...
And this is the amount that it's compressing by. And I want to move this threshold until it compresses by about -3. That's a pretty good amount of compression.
Hello, and welcome to Going Places, a new podcast from Flux Rotherham. Hello, and welcome to Going Places.
So that's now compressing by about 3. And these are basic attack times and releases for audio compression. Now, what you do in a compressor is, because you've squashed it and you've made it a bit quieter, you then use what's called a makeup gain to bring the audio of everything up so it's more consistent across the piece. You've tamed those dynamics. So you've made the loud things quieter, but you've made the quiet things louder. And that's probably the key point here. So I'm now
and welcome to
going to pull this up by 3 dB. So what we've compressed in 3 dB, I'm going to add back in as gain.
Hello, and welcome to Going Places, a new pod...
Might even add a little bit more there.
Hello, and welcome to Going Places, a new pod...
So it's a bit louder than it was to start off with. We've compressed it, we've tamed the dynamics. Now, in my signal processing chain, I've then usually got a noise remover, which to start off with might take too much out.
Hello, and welcome.
Yeah, and that's gone a bit muted as well. So I'm going to take it out and I'm going to listen and add as I go.
Hello, and welcome to Going Places, a new podcast from Flux Rotherham. Hello, and welcome.
Take it off.
Hello, and welcome to Going Places.
You can't really hear a lot.
Hello, and welcome to Going.
There's usually a noise reduction plugin or effect in Audacity. Sometimes it's more useful than not. But it would usually be in the processing chain that I do. So I would take out some low, I would compress the vocal, and then I would add a bit of noise reduction, particularly if that compressing we brought up some background noise that we didn't want. Okay, so that's a basic signal processing chain. You might have a really sticky piece of audio that was recorded in a really difficult place. So then sometimes I might be doing a little bit of EQing after I've done my noise reduction if I feel like everything's gone a bit flat and it needs something adding to it. So these are little incremental changes. They're incremental ways to change your audio. Not unlike, perhaps possibly for some visual artists out there, not unlike what you do in Photoshop to an image. You don't just push the dial all the way up to the top. You do a little bit and you see what it looks like. And then you might add another bit after you've done something else. And they're little small incremental changes that end up to a larger change on output. Okay, so I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. And when you start editing with audio, you'll constantly be zooming in and out like this to be able to see things and then to be able to see the bigger picture. So now that I've made that audio what I think sounds good, and I've processed it, I'm going to chop it up quickly. So
hello and welcome to...
So that's the bit where I stumbled.
I'll start that again.
Yeah. So I'm going to cut this, and in Logic, That's on a second command click tool. So I'm going to cut it here. I'm going to click that, delete it. And I'm going to bring this up a little bit. And the other thing I'm going to do here, and we use this a lot in Audio Edit World, is I'm going to add a little fade at the beginning of this. So the audio isn't going to just crash in. It's going to just gradually fade up. Okay, so we've got this first little section.
Hello, and welcome to Going Places, a new podcast from Flux Rotherham.
Then I add a little coughing fit here, so I'm going to cut this bit out. And as I remember this second bit...
In this episode, we'll be chatting to June Smith.
I stumbled there.
In this episode...
So we're going to start again now. So I'm going to take that stumble out, pull this one across. Now, sometimes, let's have a listen to see if that pause here is long enough, or it's right, or it needs changing.
From Flux Rotherham. In this episode...
That's pretty good. Now, sometimes people might put what's called a crossfade on here, and in Logic, that's just a simple pull of that arrow across there. But that's basically crossfading from one piece of audio to another. And it means that you make that transition between two clips that butt up against each other, you make them softer. Okay, so now we've got
Rotherham
out of there.
In this episode, we'll be chatting to June Smith from the local transport museum about all things...
Okay, so we need to cut this bit out from where I say and I do a little here, which is that little piece there. I'm going to cut all that out, get rid, drag this bit back. Let's have a little fade there, a little crossfade, just to soften that up, and let's have a listen now. So I'm going to zoom out.
Hello, and welcome to Going Places, a new podcast from Flux Rotherham.
It's iterative.
In this episode, over and over again, we'll be chatting to June Smith from the local transport museum about all things train and tram related in South Yorkshire.
Okay. Now then, you can hear me, I think, stumbling on my keyboard or something. I'm just going to pull that back, and again I'm going to add a little fade at the end of that so it doesn't just crash out again. And what we could do is we could add a fade to this music. I'm going to make that fade much longer. Can you see I'm pulling that? And then in Logic you can make that fade slightly more aggressive. I'm going to pull it down here. I'm going to pull my speaking underneath that track. So that track of me speaking is going to start underneath this audio playing. Let's listen.
Hello, and welcome to Going Places, a new podcast from Flux Rotherham.
Okay, so you've got your music fading out underneath the introduction. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more track. New audio track, and this one will default to stereo, and I want a stereo track, so I'm going to add a little bit of field recording. So this is a podcast about transport, so let's add some field recording of a train. So let's say file and import, and I got this from, what's it called, Freesound, which we looked at in the other session. So this is a Creative Commons licensed piece of audio. Okay, and this is actually a train approaching Sheffield Station. Right, so I'm going to zoom back out so I can see. Now we might go through this and listen to which bit might be best. I'm just going to cut it to here for now, just to demonstrate. Get rid of that, make it a little bit bigger again. And what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to put a big long fade under this. And when we start talking about trains, I'm going to put that underneath it, so that we're sort of situating what this conversation is going to be about.
A new podcast from Flux Rotherham. In this episode, we'll be chatting to June Smith from the local transport museum about all things train and tram related in South Yorkshire.
Here comes your bit underneath it. There you go. You situated your conversation. There's a bit of field recording or whatever. But there, so you've got this really just simple idea of all of these tracks underneath each other. And I'm probably going to come back in a minute and we'll talk about mastering and looking at just making sure that none of the levels are too loud or too quiet. And then I'll take you through into exporting. All right, so let's just stop sharing. Okay, and then put this back on. Okay, so that was that little demo. So on to mixing. So back in the analog world, mixing was something that you did separately after you'd arranged all your tracks. But with digital technology, most people are mixing as they go. They're adjusting to taste volume. They're changing the volume of things as they add them or edit them. But essentially, it's a balancing act. You're making sure nothing sounds too loud or too quiet in your mix. Nothing jars when it comes in or is too faint to hear properly. It's a delicate process and it's an iterative one. And part of it is what we call A-Being, which is essentially listening to something before you've changed it and after, and going back and switching back and forth quite quickly to try and discern whether the change you've made sounds good or not, sounds right to your ears. And again, part of that process and getting used to that process is about referencing. We talked about referencing before in the previous session that I gave you. Just listening to other people's podcasts and getting a feeling for what they sound like and how they should make you feel. So listening to before and after things that have changed is really, really good. And it's how you should be working all the time. So you're making sure that you've enhanced the audio and that it sounds in keeping with the rest of the mix. And again, this is an iterative process. All the while, you're keeping your eye on the main output to make sure it's not going into the red. And often we use looping sections like I looped the beginning of that piece of dialogue. And crucially, you don't mix with your eyes, you mix with your ears, all right? Now, obviously, you're looking at your screen. There's nothing you can do about that. And you've got to use your eyes to navigate. But especially for podcasts, check your mix on your headphones because that's how lots of people interact with podcasts. And if you find something that's a bit difficult or sticky to edit or change or process, shut your eyes. Put the loop on and shut your eyes. And rather than kind of focusing on what's happening on screen in front of you, shut your eyes and put yourself in the position of that listener. Okay. So we're going to go on to, I'm going to just quickly talk about mastering. So stop sharing again. Okay, so hopefully this isn't going to sound crazy. Okay, so at the moment, just when the music is on the audio, it's peaking around sort of -15, something like that. What happens when we put music and dialogue in?
Hello, and welcome to Going
So I'm
Places,
peaking at
a
about
new podcast from
-12
Flux
now.
Rotherham.
It's gone up a little bit here in my
In
output.
this episode, we'll be chatting to June Smith from the local Transport Museum about all things train and tram related in South Yorkshire.
Now that's a bit loud for me when that comes in. I'm starting to lose my dialogue underneath it. So I'm going to turn the whole thing down a little bit. And I can either do that in this track header bit here, or I can do it here in Logic. Oh, and let's just change that to field recording. I forgot to do that. Okay, so that's a little bit loud for my liking. So I'm just going to turn it down a bit. Let's listen again.
Train and tram related in South Yorkshire.
Yeah, that's better. Right, for now, I'm just going to make that a lot smaller and we're going to fade it out again at the end. So now, if I select all of these things and I say set locators, it's now going to cycle round this, but I'm also telling Logic this is the bit that I want to use. It's also the bit that I'm going to want to export. Now then, mastering really quickly. Personally, the way that I do it is that I put it through a bit of an emulator, which gives it a bit of an analog feel to start off with. That's just a channel strip. I'll show that here. But it's also got a different EQ on it. So if everything I feel, I don't know, I'm listening to it, and then I think, I go and listen to something, I don't know, from Radio 4 that I like. and it's my thing is a bit crispy. It's a bit too like fizzy and top endy. I'm going to EQ it here right at the end, because this channel is the output channel. So what I do to this channel changes everything, not just an individual track, but it changes the mix of everything. So if I wanted to, I could make some EQ changes here. But what I'm going to do for me personally here is I just like the way this sounds. It's got a little analog button on it and it just warms everything up a little bit. So I do that on my stereo output. And then the last thing usually on a mastering output, so when you've finished everything, mixed it, got everything about where you want it, you put what's called a limiter on it. And this is a maximizing limiter. But basically, I'm going to say to this limiter, I don't want this audio to ever go above -1. That's my output ceiling. Remember, 0 dB is distorting. What I'm trying to do is make this as loud as it can be for when it goes onto Spotify or SoundCloud or whatever, without it distorting. And that's where my headroom comes in. Now I've got somewhere to play with. I can move the output of the whole thing without distorting things. So I'm going to play this round and I'm going to pull this threshold down till I'm getting somewhere more like about -3 over here on my output, something like that. Okay, I'm going to pull this threshold down. You should see the output going up. See it going up? So it's peaking at about 9 at the moment.
Hello, and welcome to Going Places, a new podcast from Flux Rotherham. In this episode, we'll be chatting to June Smith from the local Transport Museum about all things train and tram related in South Yorkshire.
That's pretty good there, and that peaked at about, that's giving me like a live feed of the peak level, and it peaked at about -4. I'm happy with that. But on this output, I've pulled that whole volume up to make everything louder at the end. Okay, so I'm just going to save that. And then I'm going to bounce it. In Logic, we call this bouncing. We're basically bouncing down all the tracks to one track, to the thing that we're going to put on SoundCloud, Spotify. In Audacity, it's usually called export or export as. And I'm going to bounce this down as an MP3. If you see that PCM word there, that's exactly the same thing as a WAV. It's just another industry term for WAV, okay? And you can, if you want to, export more than one. Sometimes for clients, I might do a WAV and an MP3. Most people these days can't tell the difference. And for most export now and going up onto podcast hosts, you'd use an MP3. So here's my MP3. I'm going to bounce this offline rather than in real time. So it's not going to play through. It's just going to bounce in offline. And I'm not going to normalize. Quite often you'll see a little checkbox on your export or your bounce that says, do you want to normalize? Don't do that. Otherwise, you're going to potentially get right up to almost distorting and clipping. So stay away from normalization. Normalization is not your friend. Okay. These can all stay as they are. So I'm going to say, okay. Now then, I did a little version of this. Let's say I'm working for a client and this is the second time I've done this. So I'm going to call it version 2. Version 2 and the date. What's the date? 29th. And there it is. And then it should be my bounce file. So if I come down like that and show you. It's in the bounce files of my project file. This is my project. And here's what we just bounced. So it's all together in one file. That intro is a bit long for me, actually.
Hello, and welcome to Going Places, a new podcast from Flux Rotherham.
She goes on, this bird, sorry.
In this episode, we'll be chatting to June Smith from the local Transport Museum about all things train and tram related in South Yorkshire.
So there you go. There's your exported MP3 ready to go up and be hosted somewhere. So let's just stop sharing, go back quickly to my presentation. Sorry, I keep stopping and starting this. Desktop 2. We're nearly done, and then we can have some questions. Okay. So we talked about mixing. It's a balancing act. A being monitoring your output using your ears rather than your eyes, or a combination of both. So mastering, what we've just done, what people would call output. So the final stage of audio production, and in a professional context, this is often done by a separate mastering engineer. It's often thought of as a bit of a dark art in music circles, particularly that there's a lot of kind of jargon and other stuff that goes around it. And often it's a very complex mixture of using inbox processing and outboard gear. However, we can master and get up our outputs to similar levels very easily using open source pieces of software and techniques. So common processing techniques for mastering tracks, including compressors, EQs, limiters and maximizers, that's what I've just done, and meters. And loudness in podcast land is measured in, I don't know who makes this stuff up, in a scale called LUFS. Loudness units full scale. Who came up with that? I don't know. There is an explainer, a link in the reference notes at the end of this, again in the PDF that will be available, to a link to an explainer about LUFS itself, and also a link to a free loudness meter plugin made by Julian, which you can use in Audacity, which will measure your output in LUFS. Okay. In Audacity, to master something, to change its output, what you would do is you would bounce down or export all of your tracks together as an unmastered, if you like, MP3 or WAV, and then you bring them back into Audacity, and then you'd make those changes to that one file, because it doesn't have the ability to make changes to a stereo output like Logic does. But the principles are the same. Okay. Your export settings, again, we just talked about, it's really common now to export to MP3. And it's quicker generally and easier to upload and download and distribute an MP3. However, we worked in WAV in the first instance to record and edit to get the best possible sound quality. Okay. Right, hosting, we talked a bit about before. There's a really good explainer and list of hosting again, which is in the links part of this. Your organization or Flux, for instance, might have a platform or existing accounts for hosting like SoundCloud, like Spotify. SoundCloud is really good and can work for sort of short form, limited stuff up to about 3 hours of free content. YouTube again can work, but you would need to convert your podcast to a video with some kind of image file, and you'd need to do that in a video editing software. If you find yourself wanting to make something that's got more episodes or that is more episodic in nature and has a wider reach, it might be worth looking at some kind of paid hosting service, which could be part of your project, for instance, part of your workshop project, something that's ongoing. And that in turn will generate an RSS feed like we talked about in the previous session, which in turn makes your content more accessible to more people. Gosh, I feel like I've completely waffled on then and said a whole lot of stuff. Has anybody got any questions? Would anyone like to discuss anything?
Thanks, Kitty. That was fairly mind-blowing.
I hope it wasn't ear-blowing. I'm so sorry.
No, it wasn't ear-blowing.
That it was fine. Gremlins in the machine.
Any questions, anybody?
It might be a buffering thing, actually, a bandwidth thing, and my bandwidth isn't great down here. That might be what it is. Anyway, hit me. Ask me some things.
I've got a question. Is there a way that that is there like a studio we can go to try out these things, like just do a little short project and experiment and be mentored?
I'm going to let Helen chime in here.
Yeah, so we were gonna put together a day so where people can drop in and have a play, because I think that's the way a lot of people learn. So we will we'll get a date with Kitty and we'll send that out to everybody. That would mean you coming to us to do that and just having a bit of a play. We haven't put anything in like a sort of long-term mentoring or so on, but we can think about that as well, so that we maybe give Kitty a bit of time so that she can, I guess, answer questions on a bit more of an ongoing basis. And because I think lots of us learn through doing, don't we? So we have got the kit. It's like sitting on the floor of our office. So I think
Great.
people having a play would be a really good idea.
Where is your office, by the way?
So we're in central Rotherham. So we're based at Voluntary Action Rotherham. So it's like a 10-minute walk from the train station or 5 minutes from the town centre.
Voluntary Action Rotherham.
Okay. Yeah, so the kit, I think we had a couple of questions last time about the kit being available outside of Rotherham. It's not really, because it's bought for the project, which is Flux Rotherham. So we get Arts Council funding, which is specific to the Rotherham Borough. But there are obviously other, I know somebody, I don't know if anybody joined from Sheffield, but Rivelin Co have got podcasting kit that they can loan out too.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? Anyone thinking of doing a podcast?
Has anybody just got some ideas about? But we've got a little hand up there. Tell us about your podcast.
So I work for a youth centre in Dinnington called Jade Youth and Community, and so at night time it's just an old-fashioned youth club, and in the daytime it's an AP, alternate provision, for children and young people who can't access school. And while they're reluctant to do anything with literacy, they're really happy to work with technology. So you're looking at bridging that gap between literacy and actually physically writing, which they're not keen on, but also some work around self-advocacy as well. So, and then I stop talking, so that it would be great.
Brilliant. Fabulous.
Anybody else got any ideas? Yeah, Lars says, Nanny, it's not far from Raw. So yeah, it is literally a 3-minute walk up the road from Rotherham.
Oh, yeah.
Renaissance.
Okay.
Yeah. So we will be sharing both recordings and both slide decks that Kitty's done. And I'll find some easy way of doing that. And we might just put them on YouTube so that people can access, and then we'll send you a link so that you can access and have a bit of a kind of go through afterwards. And then we will send a date round about a drop-in session as well, if nobody's got any more questions. I think we're all good. Thank you, Kitty. That was brilliant. So yeah, I don't know if everybody joined the first session as well, but we will make sure you get both recordings so that they piece together. But yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for listening to me waffle on.
Thanks, it was really great.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, guys.